Now, from a very early point in our history, it became clear that politics would play a role in the selection of just justices of the Supreme Court and judges of lower court. That happened in 1795. Now, of course, all of you know how immensely popular President George Washington was. Actually, he was made president by a unanimous vote. And some people actually thought of him as the nearest thing we have to a king. And so his popularity was huge. No one doubted the wisdom of George Washington. But when George Washington nominated John Rutledge to be the second Chief Justice of the United States, by the way, the opening occurred because John Jay, the first Chief Justice, was not so impressed with what work was like on the Supreme Court. He resigned to run for and become the governor of New York State. He thought that was a much more important role. But John Rutledge, who had served very briefly as one of George Washington's first associate justices, but had resigned and accepted a lower office in South Carolina. John Rutledge wrote a note to George Washington when Jay retired and said, "Why not me?" Because Rutledge had wanted to be the first Chief Justice, but Washington did not pick him to be. He chose John Jay. So Rutledge wrote to George Washington saying, "Why not me? Why not make me the second Chief Justice of the United States?" Well, he was nominated. Washington agreed to do that. The Senate was in recess at the time, so the Senate could not have the opportunity to act on his nomination. So Rutledge was put on the court as what's called a recess appointment. The Senate was in recess, so it couldn't act. And what that meant was that he, under the Constitution, could only serve temporarily. That is, he could serve throughout 1 year of the next Congress and then would have to leave unless he were confirmed by the Senate. Not long after he began serving temporarily as the Chief Justice, he did a very impolitic thing, a treaty to finally end the War of Independence between the United States. The Revolutionary War was very much favored by George Washington, and it had been ratified by the Senate of the United States. John Rutledge, in a speech that would doom his nomination, was bitterly critical of the Jay Treaty. He said he would rather have President Washington die than have him concur in that treaty. And he called it a puerile instrument. The Senate of the United States was not about to approve the nomination to be Chief Justice of a person who was so obviously opposed to something that both the President and the Senate had concurred. So they voted him down. 10 in favor, 14 against. So that established a precedent, and it is a precedent that has lasted to this day, that there is no guarantee that when a president, however popular the president, makes a nomination to the Supreme Court, that nominee will actually be confirmed to serve a life term on the Senate. Now, I want to switch gears a little bit here as we continue our talk about representative government under the Constitution. Remember, we are focusing on the Constitution as the instrument by which the people of this country, exercising their sovereign power to govern themselves, choose their representatives. What emerged from Philadelphia was a republic and not a democracy. And I mentioned to you, of course, briefly, that a republic is one in which the sovereign people choose their representatives to act on their behalf. A democracy, like New England town meetings, is where the people themselves are the government. They make the choices and they carry out the choices of government. Now, before we move on beyond this question of republic versus democracy, I want us to spend just a couple of minutes talking about James Madison's ideas about a republic. This is terribly important because in this lecture, we are talking about the political arms of the government. Those two branches of the government that are accountable to the people through the election process. They are the political branches. The Supreme Court is a non-political branch. But we are talking about those two branches in terms of being representative of the people. Madison in Federalist number 10, by the way, it is the most quoted part of the Federalist Papers and is widely used and cited in American history courses all across the country. Because in the beginning, Madison was the best exponent of the idea that the greatest threat to what we were creating in this new government was what he called factions, or the spirit of faction. Madison and then the other political leaders at the time were well aware of the recent rebellion in Massachusetts led by Daniel Shays, which was a farmers' revolt against debt collections. So what the rebellion attempted to do was to close the courthouses in Massachusetts so they could not carry out the debt collection processes that would endanger the farms and livelihoods. And Madison looked at the phenomenon of factions, and he said, what we discover is it is a part of human nature. You cannot avoid having it. There will be factions whenever any collection of people get together, because there will be small groups among them who will get together with shared beliefs and decide to act on those shared beliefs. But those will serve the interests of the faction and not serve the larger public good. Having satisfied himself and his readers of Federalist 10 that you could not stop the development of factions, he argued that you could, in fact, deal with its effects. And his answer to that was the organization of a republic, because he said the republic will attract competent people into office. And if you extend the formation of the republic across the whole country, as the new Constitution did, then factions that developed in particular locations in the country will not spread necessarily or easily from one state to another. So having a republic with the people's representatives chosen from across the country, the republic would be the salvation of its own future. America's government, as created in 1787, would be enduring for posterity.